So the verse of the Mithaq is Surah Al-A'raf, verse 172. And it comes after the story of Moses, and one of the longest sections of the Quran about Moses and the children of Israel. And the Quran says, وَإِذْ أَخَذَ رَبُّكَ مِنْ بَنِي آدَمَ مِنْ ظُهُورِهِمْ. Recall when your Lord brought forth from the children of Adam, from their loins, ذُرِّيَّتَهُمْ, their progeny, their descendants. وَأَشْهَدَهُمْ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ. And he had them testify against themselves or regarding themselves. أَشْهَدَ عَلَىٰ, you can testify for or testify against. أَشْهَدَهُمْ عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ. So he caused them to testify on themselves, regarding themselves. أَلَسْتُ بِرَبِّكُمْ. This is a rhetorical question in the first person. Am I not your God? Am I not your Lord? أَلَسْتُ بِرَبِّكُمْ. قَالُوا بَلَى. They replied, yes. شَهِدْنَا, we testify. أَن تَقُولُوا, he cautioned, somebody cautioned, the angels cautioned, or Qadr is cautioning, or the predestination is cautioning, right? أَن تَقُولُوا يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ إِنَّا كُنَّا عَنْ هَذَا غَافِلِينَ. So that you would not have the right to say. Now you cannot say on the day of judgment, we didn't know you were our God. We didn't know who was our God. We were unaware of the reality of lordship. So this is a verse that has been called the verse of the Mithaq, the verse of the covenant. Now, the verse itself is an extremely deep and profound verse. It has been interpreted so many different ways by so many different people. It is called Yawm Alas, the day of Alastu, am I not? In Persian, it is called Ruzi Alas, the day of Alas. It is also called the Ayatul Mithaq, the verse of the covenant. The reason why it's called the verse of the covenant is because hadith literature, Sunni hadith literature, mentions and interprets this verse and says that your Lord took أَخَذَ رَبُّكَ مِيثَاق. Your Lord took a mithaq, means a strong covenant from the children of Adam. So this is called the day or the verse of the mithaq. Now, before we get to Ibn Taymiyyah, very quickly, what are the pre-Ibn Taymiyyah mainstream standard Sunni hadith-based, literalist-based, Ahl al-Hadith-based interpretations of the verse? Again, a quick sampling. At-Tabari, who is the dawn of Athari, tafsir, he is the giant, the encyclopedia. Ibn Taymiyyah loves At-Tabari. He goes, it's the best tafsir ever written. At-Tabari has a staggering 10 pages of, and this is like literally of the massive volume here. This is like the big volume of At-Tabari. Literally, he's got like 10 pages, 40 reports of Ibn Abbas and Abu Hurairah and Umar and so many companions and so many of the students of the companions, which presents a very vivid picture. This is an actual extraction. God from Adam, from one person Adam, God extracted all of mankind, and God spoke directly to the souls of mankind. This took place on earth. This took place before our births, before me and your births. There was an existence before our existence, and that existence is the birth of the soul. And so this takes place when God sends Adam down to the earth. One of the first things he does is he extracts from Adam all of the children of Adam, and he testifies, or he causes them to testify. He tells them, am I not your Lord? The rhetorical question, am I not your Lord? And they respond, yes, we accept you are our Lord. We know you are our Lord. So At-Tabari is very clear. There is no other interpretation. This is an actual covenant, an actual extraction, an actual live, incident taking place, and God speaks to mankind, and mankind responds to God. And this mithaq, or this covenant, is now embedded in the psyche of man, not the psyche, the psyche of man, in the subconsciousness of man. Ibn Abdul Barr as well, the great Andalusian scholar, again, and Ibn Taymiyyah loves him, quotes him all the time. Ibn Abdul Barr also has a very extensive commentary in the Muwatta of Imam Malik when he has his Tamheed. He talks about this reality, and Ibn Taymiyyah quotes him. Ibn Taymiyyah is well aware of Ibn Abdul Barr's interpretation. Al-Wahidi, again, one of the icons of Athari tafsir, his 30 volumes of Tafsir al-Basit, which has just been recently published. Again, Al-Wahidi is very explicit in this regard, and he mentions that the Ahlul Athar, the Mufassirin, the Ahlul Ilm, that's what he calls them. Basically, all of the people worthy to follow, they said an actual extraction takes place, and there's an actual covenant. Then he quickly says, As for the ashabul ma'ani, those that don't care about the athar, those that don't care about ilm and the real mufassir, these are pseudo-intellectuals. As for the ashabul ma'ani, they say this is metaphorical. And then he goes on, right? So again, al-Wahidi is saying there's an actual extraction and an actual conversation, and this is the default of the mufassirun and the ahlul ilm and the ahlul athar. Athar means those who are following the reports. Imam al-Baghawi is the same. Ibn Atiyya, he concedes that a metaphorical interpretation could be linguistically possible. But then he goes, but then this interpretation contradicts, and then he says mutawatir, like it has been narrated by too many people, reports from the Prophet ﷺ that indicates an actual covenant. So Ibn Atiyya says, you know what, if there were no hadith at all, then maybe the verse is symbolic. Maybe there's no actual extraction, and you can interpret it to be something else. What that something else is, we'll talk about on the next slide. But he says we can't do that because there's just too many reports to do this, right? Ibn al-Jawzi as well, in his famous tafsir, he lists a number of athar, and he lists a number of reports that indicate the actual covenant. But then he goes, but there is a Zajjaj, one of the early commentators who wasn't really known to be a part of the Athari school per se. He goes, as Zajjaj says, this is a interpretation. This is a symbolic covenant. It's not an actual covenant. Now we can go on and on, but the summary is the default position of pre-Sunni scholars of tafsir who emphasize the tradition, who emphasize the narrations, who emphasize hadith, is that an actual extraction took place, an actual conversation, an actual scenario takes place in which God speaks to mankind. This is pretty much the default position pre-Ibn Taymiyyah of those who followed the Athari school, or the Hanbali, or Hanbali theologically for the advanced students, not Hanbali fiqh-wise. Basically pre-Ibn Taymiyyah types of understandings of Islam. Now there has been an alternative opinion pre-Ibn Taymiyyah, and that is found by the Mu'tazilites and by some of the Ash'arites. The Mu'tazilites, Zamakhshari is the main one I'm going to quote here, but again, there's others as well. The Mu'tazilites, Zamakhshari in his Kashaf says that, this verse, it's min bab al-tamthili wa takhyil, right? This is literally what he says, right? That it's a type of metaphor. It's like imagery, takhyil. It's like imagination. It's not actual. There was no actual extraction, right? And what the verse implies is nasb al-adillati shahidati ala sihhatiha al-uqul, that God gave us brains, God gave us minds. So this is not an actual covenant. No, there's no conversation taking place. No, the verse is saying metaphorically that God gave us minds to think, and he gave us evidences in the world around us that conform with the minds that Allah has given us, that God has given us, right? And so Az-Zamakhshari is saying there was no actual covenant. No, there's no mithaq taking place. Rather, this is a symbolism of the intellect, the human intellect. And God is saying that he has blessed us with the brains to think, to rationalize, and he's given us all the evidences to know he is one. And Fakhruddin al-Razi, who is Ibn Taymiyyah's nemesis, Ibn Taymiyyah's main interlocutor in a number of books, Ibn Taymiyyah really took al-Razi to be like one of the main points of contention. And interestingly enough, side point here, he almost ignores Ghazali. We emphasize Ghazali a lot. Ibn Taymiyyah kind of sort of sidelines him. It's like not a big guy for him. It's al-Razi who is like the heavyweight for Ibn Taymiyyah. He hardly mentioned Ghazali, by the way. Interesting. I actually have a paper I was writing. If God gives me time, I'll try to finish it up. Ibn Taymiyyah and his position on Ghazali. But al-Razi is the big guy, right? The entire Dar al-Ta'arud, like the 10 volume my PhD was on, right? The entire Dar al-Ta'arud is a refutation of al-Razi. 10 volumes refuting al-Razi. And al-Razi concedes in this verse, when he comments on it in his, the famous, the Tafsir al-Kabir of Fakhruddin al-Razi, al-Razi basically says that we know that the Mufassirun and the Ahlul Athar have interpreted a literal extraction. We know this, that's their version, right? But then he goes over, this is batil, like this is impossible to be the case. And then he goes for 12 reasons. 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't have time to go into those 12, but feel free to read directly from his Tafsir al-Kabir. He goes for 12 reasons this cannot have taken place. And then he says, so the real interpretation, which is the interpretation of the people of reflection, ahlul nazar, right? وَأَرْبَابَ الْعُقُولِ, and the people and the masters of intellect, is that this verse implies that God, basically Zamakhshari's, that God gave evidences to mankind and he gave them a sound intellect to understand those evidences. Okay, so basically Zamakhshari and Al-Razi come to the same conclusion, even though Razi never quotes Zamakhshari, and he's using some of the same principles and even the same evidences as the Zamakhshari. Okay, so before we get to Ibn Taymiyyah, we clearly now have the mainstream Sunni trajectory. When I say Sunni here, I mean the Ahlul Athar, the following the traditions, following the Sahaba Tabi'un, the reports of the past. And we have explicit narrations that this is the default position, even from Al-Razi and Al-Baghawi and others, that they say, look, this is, and Al-Baghawi and others mention, what am I saying here? Sorry. Ibn Atiyah mentions that we might have the possibility to interpret it another way, but we can't because there's mutawatir reports, right? So now we get to Ibn Taymiyyah, and this is super interesting because one would assume the stereotype people have of Ibn Taymiyyah is that how dare you go against the mutawatir reports? How can you possibly, go against the default position of the Mufassirun and the Ahl al-Athar? So he too would affirm an actual covenant. But no, in his Dar al-Ta'arud, which I've summarized in my PhD was about Dar al-Ta'arud, right? So in his Dar al-Ta'arud, he actually, really interestingly enough, adopts the position of Zamakhshari and Al-Razi, adopts it with a modification, as we'll see. Okay.
Can I jump in, Yasir, with one just small point of clarification? Could you just translate the full title of Dar al-Ta'arud, because people might not know the Arabic, because it pertains to this. Yeah.
Averting the conflict, averting the potential conflict between reason and revelation. Okay. Averting the conflict between reason and revelation. So Ibn Taymiyyah wrote, I would say, his magnum opus, and multiple people have said this is his magnum opus. Ibn Taymiyyah wrote his 10-volume theological treatise about how to reconcile faith with intellect, faith with logic and reason. And he took Al-Razi as an interlocutor. He used Al-Razi to be, the nemesis, the arch nemesis, for the entire book, basically. And then through Al-Razi, he jumps to basically the Mu'tazilas and the Falasif and whatnot. But point being that in this book, Ibn Taymiyyah, by and large, defends the tradition against the rationalists, the Mu'tazilites, and the Mutakallimun, the scholars of Kalam, right? And obviously, from his perspective, it's devastating. Now, we get to this issue of the mithaq, of the covenant. And really interesting, Ibn Taymiyyah actually denies that there was an actual covenant. And he agrees with a very important caveat, he ends up agreeing with the scholars that he generally refutes in the rest of the book. And he basically says that neither the Qur'an nor the authentic Sunnah indicates mankind actually spoke. Rather, God's extraction indicates he created them generation after generation. And their testimony is that he ingrained in them the faculties to know his lordship. Okay, this is basically Zamakhshari. This is basically Al-Razi, exactly, right? And he says here, now, but what's the caveat? What's the difference? The difference is that, and I quote from Dar al-Ta'arud, so they have in their fitra, what is the fitra? We'll come to this in a while. What allows them to verify that God alone is their Lord. And they have inherent within them what demonstrates the erroneousness of worshiping other than God. Now, the big caveat, the big difference for Al-Razi, for Az-Zamakhshari, for the scholars of Kalam and the Falasifa even and others, the verse of the Mithaq is yet another validation of the superiority of the intellect over all else. And God is saying to mankind, I've given you the brains that you can use to think, I've given you the mind, and I've given you the signs around to recognize, the truth. Okay, so they interpret this verse. There is no mithaq. They don't call it the verse of the mithaq, right? That's what the Sunnis say. That's what the Athari say. The scholars of the Athar say. This is the verse of the mithaq. Zamakhshari doesn't call it the verse of the mithaq. There is no mithaq. For them and Al-Razi, what this verse is yet another indication of the superiority of the aql over anything else. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah, here's the key point here, utilizes the same arguments, employs the same hermeneutics, brings in some of the exact same lines of poetry that Az-Zamakhshari has, which I don't get into in my slides, to come to a conclusion with one key difference. And that difference is, instead of aql, you have the fitra. This is the key difference here. Now, what exactly is the fitra? The fitra is, of course, an entire discussion altogether. I do have some lectures on it on my YouTube channel if you have time to listen, and it's also part of my dissertation. I mean, 150 pages of my, or 100 pages of my dissertation, more than 100, was about the fitra. That was one of the main points of my dissertation, Ibn Taymiyyah's utilization of the fitra. For Ibn Taymiyyah, here's the key point. The fitra is another faculty. Just like we had the faculties of hearing and seeing and sense and intellect, Ibn Taymiyyah utilized a concept that is referenced in the Qur'an, it's referenced in the Sunnah, but no theologian before Ibn Taymiyyah created an entire faculty out of this concept. Ibn Taymiyyah is the first theologian in Islamic history, to the best of my research and knowledge, to construct an entire theology, an entire epistemology around the notion of fitra. And for Ibn Taymiyyah, here's the key point. The fitra is something that is more primordial and less susceptible to corruption than the human intellect. And the fitra keeps the intellect in check. He wants a faculty that shall keep the faculties of the scholars of kalam in check, right? He wants to have, who's going to check the checkers, who's going to, teach the teachers, who's going to be in charge of the intellect. Ibn Taymiyyah says the fitra is in charge of the intellect. And the fitra, which is embodied, it is ingrained in mankind. It is a faculty that is deeper than even the intellect, and it is less susceptible to corruption, and hence the fitra will know intuitively. Sometimes the brain doesn't recognize, the fitra will recognize. And so for Ibn Taymiyyah, the verse is about the fitra. Now, very quickly, how does he prove this? Because the verse seems to be very clear, right, in this regard. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just affirming what you're saying. The verse does, I mean, the exoteric, the outer meaning of the verse seems to be clear. So, I'm very intrigued about how he negotiates this.
It's not just the outer meaning, more explicit. If you read At-Tabari's 10 pages, like 40 narrations, right? There is, At-Tabari doesn't even present two opinions. Like Tabari usually says there's two opinions, three opinions. Right. In this case, it's just like, this is it. And he brings like an entire corpus of athar from multiple sahaba, multiple tabi'un, multiple people of the past, right? Again, for those who know Ibn Taymiyyah, this is an open shut case. Like once you have precedents from the sahaba and tabi'un, once you have the athar or the narration speaking, and that's Ibn Taymiyyah's point all the time, that when you have, the authentic, Qur'an and Sunnah, intellect cannot possibly overrule the Qur'an and Sunnah. Right? Now, what does he do in this regard? So he firstly sidelines the issue of tawatur and ijma' completely. He doesn't ijma' of the Ahl al-Athar, which is mentioned by a number of people. Ibn Atiyah and others mention this. He just sidelines.
So ijma' meaning consensus, just to clarify.
The consensus of the people of one strand of Sunnism. So for Ibn Taymiyyah, the Salaf's consensus is a binding argument. Ibn Taymiyyah always says this, right? The Salaf's consensus, the Salaf are the early scholars, the first 2-3 generations of Sunni Islam. For Ibn Taymiyyah, their consensus is binding. And for Ibn Taymiyyah, tawatur is also, like tawatur is, numerous reports, is also an evidence that cannot be rejected. He actually simply bypasses the issue of tawatur and the issue of the fact that all earlier scholars from that one strand interpreted in this manner. And he begins the discussion by saying, there are two opinions on this issue. There are two opinions. And it's interesting because the other opinion does not come from the Salaf. It doesn't come from Ahl al-Athar. It comes from the Mu'tazila. But he goes, there's two opinions. And then what to do about these 40 plus narrations, what to do about all of these, quotes. He goes over them one by one. And he either says, number one, that they're not authentic in the isnad, the chain of narrators, so it can't be used. Or number two, it's not explicit, there's an actual conversation taking place, right? So either they are not sahih or they're not sarih. Either they're not authentic or they're ambiguous, and you can interpret them multiple ways. And again, this is ingenious, like going over one by one. And he rarely does this for any other issue. But essentially, by the end of these 5-10 pages, he's dismissed all the reports. Like all these reports, they don't count one by one. Okay. Then he says, there's no evidence that an actual covenant took place. Nothing from the Quran and Sunnah, right? And then he goes back to the verse itself. And again, this is technical here, but if you look at the verse here, remember when your Lord took from the children of Adam, min bani Adam. Ibn Taymiyyah says, and this is exactly what the scholars of Kalam and the Mu'tazila said, this is not from Adam. This is from the children of Adam, right? And he extracted from them their children, their dhurriyyah, their progeny. So for Ibn Taymiyyah, this is the generations of mankind one after the other. This isn't a one-off, all of mankind. This is a reference to God allowing mankind to procreate and having another generation. Then that generation comes of age and has another generation. And then that generation comes of age. This is the continuity of the genealogical realities of birth and life and death. That's what Ibn Taymiyyah did. And this is exactly what the Mu'tazila said as well, right? This is not found in At-Tabari, this is not found in Ibn Atiyah. This is like looking at the verse itself. Ibn Taymiyyah says that God is speaking that from every generation, he extracts their dhurriyyah, their progeny, right? So then he brings in a logical argument. And then, and this is like truly amazing, then he goes, even from a rational standpoint, it doesn't make sense for testimony to be taken from somebody against that same somebody. You don't take testimony from somebody for or against somebody. You take it from a third party, right? And again, this is Zamakhshari says this, right? This is a purely Mu'tazilite argument, which is a logical and rational argument, which again, for those who know Ibn Taymiyyah, to use a rational argument against the athar, this is like alarm bell should be going off, right? But here we have Ibn Taymiyyah saying you can't use somebody to testify, and that's what the verse is saying, that ashhadahum ala anfusihim. So he is saying this is not a testimony of a verbal nature. No, it can't be, because logically you don't take a testimony for somebody against that same somebody, right? You need a third party to testify. You need a neutral party to testify. And so he said that this testimony doesn't have to be verbal. It can be by one's state, one's hal. And here the testimony is their pure state of how God created them upon the pure fitra. That is their testimony, right? And so he says that, therefore, the verse is not about an actual extraction and an actual covenant and an actual back and forth. Rather, the verse is saying God has gifted mankind with an innate ability, with an inherent cognizance that God exists and God is worthy of worship and God is the Lord. This is his understanding of the verse. Now, to conclude, final 2 slides here.
Right.
For the mutakallimun, the scholars of Kalam, philosophy, Mu'tazila, the verse of the Mithaq is a reference to the power, role, and efficacy of the intellect, aql. But for Ibn Taymiyyah, the verse is about a faculty that is even more powerful, even more deeply ingrained, and hence less susceptible to corruption, because the fitra is not acquired for Ibn Taymiyyah. As for the intellect, it is acquired. You learn stuff, you learn things, right? The fitra is gifted to you from birth. This is what Ibn Taymiyyah says, quoting the Qur'an and Sunnah. The fitra is innate. The fitra is inherent. And therefore, the fitra is a faculty that is capable of keeping the role of the intellect in check. It is more powerful than the intellect, right? And so Ibn Taymiyyah uses this verse for the fitra. And therefore, the reason for this, of course, is that Ibn Taymiyyah wanted to essentially deprive the Mu'tazila and the Mutakallimun of attempting to use this verse to support their claim that the intellect is the greatest gift that has been given to mankind. Ibn Taymiyyah felt that the intellect is extremely finicky, susceptible to corruption. Ibn Taymiyyah wanted to strip them from the efficacy of their claim that their version of the intellect, again, this is the key point here, their version of the intellect is the primary source of ethics and laws and theology. And so he says this verse is about the fitra, not about the aql. In doing so, he accomplishes 2 things. Number 1, he gets rid of their interpretation, their arsenal of trying to prove the aql, to prove the supremacy of the intellect. And number two, he adds something to his own already ever-growing repertoire of trying to prove the fitra, because again, we don't have time to get into all of there, but for Ibn Taymiyyah, the fitra, so I guess I have to mention this. The fitra proves God's existence to such a level that you do not need intellectual proofs per se for the existence of God. That's the key point here. Because Ibn Taymiyyah was very much against the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God. Ibn Taymiyyah was very much against Ibn Sina's, 5 proofs for the existence of God. He felt all of these proofs were superfluous and caused more harm than good. Now, what's the alternative then, O Ibn Taymiyyah? How do we know God exists? Don't we need the aql? And here comes the fitra. No, you don't need the aql to prove God's existence. The aql is used for other areas. You don't need the intellect for any of these proofs because you have the fitra. So conclusion here, therefore, and there's a su'al and jawab here. The conclusion, therefore, is that for Ibn Taymiyyah, this verse was an evidence that God has given in mankind, blessed mankind with an innate ability from the very beginning of creation. It's embedded in mankind, and every generation is born with that innate ability, and that innate ability supersedes, it is more efficacious than even the human intellect, and therefore this verse has nothing to do with an actual covenant. It rather has to do with the fact that man is blessed with that concept of the fitra that can keep the aql in check. And with that, I can have some discussion or Q&A for you.
Thank you, Dr. Qadhi. I have a few follow-up questions. If you still have time and energy, is that okay if I ask a couple follow-up questions?
Sure.
Yeah, this is terrific because, I mean, among other things, it complicates a simplistic vision that beginning students or maybe people sort of on the margins of Islamic studies may have about Ibn Taymiyyah, that he only represents one way of thinking through questions in regard to Qur'an and Hadith, that he only sides with a certain team, that he doesn't have sort of the nimbleness to think in an original and creative way over particular issues. So yeah, it's a great example to show, in fact, how nuanced and complicated Ibn Taymiyyah's thought is, and the Islamic intellectual tradition and engagement with the Qur'an is. So that's, yeah, thank you so much for that. Okay, one immediate question that's related to Fitra. So the most famous verse of the Fitra may be in Surah Ar-Rum. Is that right?
Fitrat Allah allati fatara an-nas 'alayha. Yep.
Yeah, so in Surah 30.
The Fitra that mankind created. Yep, that's 30, yeah.
And often understood, and you can, open to your correction, to mean that the Qur'an there is alluding to God instilling in humankind from their very creation something like an instinct. I think sometimes the Arabic word ghariza is used as a sort of synonym for it, but some sort of instinct which naturally leads humans to obey God and believe in God. You've worked on this a lot, so again, we could have a long talk about this. But my particular question is, in light of Ibn Taymiyyah's view that the fitra is really what's at stake in the verse of the covenant in Quran 7:172, does that imply, and would he agree then, that the principal role of the prophets, who are given to humanity as a mercy from God, is not so much to impart new information that might lead to belief and salvation, but to remind humans of things that they should know because of the fitra?
Good point here. For Ibn Taymiyyah, the fitra is, he gives an analogy to this, like the fitra is like the uncorrupted eye, and the revelation from God is like the sun. So the eye can appreciate the beauty and the light of the sun. So when you have eyes, you can see the light, you can see the sun, right? So the fitra can recognize the truth of the prophets as vividly and as clearly as the eyes can see the light during the day, right? However, the prophets do come with more knowledge than the fitra provides.
Okay.
No doubt about that. They do come with more knowledge, but they validate what the fitra provides. And the pure fitra can recognize the veracity of the prophets instantaneously. That's the key point here. And also, the knowledge of the fitra So Ibn Taymiyyah never actually has a detailed discussion like this is what the Fitra says and this is what the Aql says. No, but I've extracted quite a lot in the dissertation. For Ibn Taymiyyah, the Fitra gives us basic necessary knowledge of God's oneness, God's perfection, God's existence, God's right to be worshipped. The Fitra finds comfort in worshiping God. So there's an element of spirituality. The Fitra knows the basics of morality, but not the details of morality. And so conscience, right? When you lie, when you steal, when you cheat, the Fitra knows you're not supposed to do that. That's why you feel guilty, right? So for Ibn Taymiyyah, it's actually a theological faculty, a psychological faculty, a spiritual faculty, all combined in one.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, great. And for a second follow-up question, and maybe we'll bring Ibn Taymiyyah in here again, but it's more about the verse itself. And here I'd like to speak about another Qadhi, Wadad al-Qadhi, former professor of the University of Chicago. So she wrote an article, which I believe is more or less the transcript of a lecture she gave to the American Philosophical Association.
Yes.
It was published, freely available online for those who are interested. The article is entitled "The Primordial Covenant." That's how she refers to this verse, and human history in the Qur'an. Maybe she gives something away by titling the article "Primordial Covenant," because she does advocate for the more literal interpretation of this verse, that it is alluding to a real moment, as you said in your presentation, before or after the creation of Adam and his descent or fall to earth, or entrance into earth, but then before the creation of the rest of his descendants. So she brings in this another verse, which she speaks about the verse of the trust, or the amana, in which she discusses, this is Quran 33:72. She discusses them together, and that's where, I'm sure you know the verse well and could probably recite it for us, but that's where God offers the trust to the mountains and to other natural features, and then only humans finally take upon themselves this amana, this trust. So she brings these two verses together, and she says, I'll just quote a bit from the article here. I'll be interested in your response, especially about one point. She says, according to them, thus, the two verses, them is the exegetes, the mufassirun. According to them, thus, the two verses in the Quran that refer to man's formative stage and pre-existence make man's obedience to God the fundamental element that governs the relationship between man and God. So that's one point. So obedience is sort of the principal duty or responsibility of humans in regard to God. And then she continues, furthermore, both verses insinuate that this situation is an ideal one that is difficult for man to sustain, and they point to the strong likelihood of a departure from this ideal. So that's really what I want to get your thoughts on. I mean, would you agree with that assessment, that the Amana verse in the verse of the covenant, so-called verse of the covenant, speak to the difficulty of humanity's obedience to God? Would you say this is the Quranic approach more generally in regard to humans' disposition and the struggles they have to obey God?
So that is, of course, an interpretation. Firstly, the correlation between the Mithaq verse and the Amana verse, it is up for grabs. You will have an entire spectrum. Okay. And I don't think Ibn Taymiyyah correlated between the two. Okay. And in all likelihood, and even mainstream Sunnis would actually, meaning like people like Al-Baghawi, Ibn Ati, and others, they would view this as two separate things. So even so, those who interpreted an actual Mithaq, right, that is not the Amana. That's something else. The Amana is the fact that now what exactly is the Amana depends on which interpretation you follow. Many would say this was the opportunity to be different from the other creations, the opportunity to have the eternal salvation of God, the potential for salvation, which comes with the risk of punishment, right?
Which is distinctive to humanity, right? This somehow distinguishes humans as rational creatures from all other created.
Exactly. So so obviously the scholars of Kalam would also interpret this as rationality, the benefits of rationality, whereas the scholars of the Athar or the others would say this is simply a privilege given to mankind, that he has the potential to have everlasting life in God's pleasure, Whereas the rest of the creation, like, the animals and whatnot, they don't have that, the potential to attain salvation, the potential to be with God for all of eternity. Now, that potentiality comes with certain perks, and intellect is one of them. But the reference is not to the intellect, according to this strand of Islam that Ibn Taymiyyah comes from. So, does the Quran suggest that salvation is difficult for mankind? I that's an interpretation, obviously. I would say that's not Ibn Taymiyyah's view. I don't think that's Ibn Taymiyyah's view. And the reason being that the verse of the Mithaq actually does not give any such indication. On the contrary, the verse of the Mithaq is quite neutral. I'm gifting you, even from Ibn Taymiyyah's interpretation, I'm gifting you with the faculty to know that I'm here and you should be worshiping me, right? Now, the verse of the Amana, yeah, that ends on a bit of a harsh note, right? Is that إِنَّهُ كَانَ ظَلُومًا جَهُولًا. Mankind was so ignorant in this regard, he thought he could do it and he didn't do it, right? But the response to that would be, this is a rebuke to those who don't follow the prophets. Because God, I like to joke when I speak with my Christian friends, for God so loved the world that he sent continuous prophets unto us. That's how I like to phrase it, right? So,
like John 3:16.
Exactly, that's my version, right? For God so loved the world, he sent a continuous series of prophets to us, right? So the purpose being that from the perspective of Muslims, by and large, it's not that mankind is disadvantaged, it's that his animalistic instincts cloud his judgment that God blessed him with, right? So again, one could quote the other verse in the Quran that وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ. The default, we created man in the best of all ways, right? Then ثُمَّ رَدَدْنَاهُ أَسْفَلَ سَافِلِينَ. The default, you should go up there. The default, how God created you, is that you should rise up. But unfortunately, problems of this world, your animalistic instincts, you're clouding, the realities, you're wanting to follow the traditions of your forefathers. That's what impedes your progress, not God, not the blessings of God, not the fact that God is sending prophets. That would be a fairly mainstream interpretation. So again, Professor Widad has the right to hold that view. I don't think I would subscribe to that view personally.
Right. Okay.